Welcome to Podcast 6, Closing the Consumer Clothing Loop, Recommendations and Next Steps. Thank you so much for listening and watching today. I'm joined by my PhD collaborators, Professor Deirdre Shaw and Dr Katherine Duffy. And today we're going to be discussing the research contribution and the recommendations and way forward for the research. And we're going to start by discussing how important it is in the PhD to have that contribution at the end of the research. Deirdre, if I could ask you to start by telling us about how important the contribution is and how we got to this point.
Yeah, thank you, Lynn. It's really nice to be here today and to see the end of your PhD, but the start of the next stages. A PhD is a contribution to knowledge, so it has to do that in order to be a PhD. But I think firstly, what's really important is identifying a research problem. So in this particular piece of research, what we were really interested in was the attention around the impact of clothing, both socially and on the environment, and what people do with their clothing at the point of disposal. So I guess that was a broader picture around the research problem. And at the same time, we were really interested in the attention given to the circular economy, but the positioning of the consumer, or rather lack of positioning of the consumer within the circular economy. So while the consumer is clearly there, what we do as consumers in terms of our acquisition, use, maintenance and disposal of our clothing isn't really sufficiently unpacked. So we have this social and environmental issues and challenges around clothing. We have the circular economy coming in as a potential solution to that, but there's still so much we don't know in terms of what the circular economy can offer us at a practical level, how consumers truly need to engage in a circular system. So in that sense, the research is really pertinent in terms of addressing a significant and real-world challenge. And I think any piece of research really needs to start off with that problem, that research problem. And given the current challenges we have in society right now, I think it's really important that any piece of research really does address and contribute positively to addressing the challenges that we're facing as a society currently. And then if you have clearly embedded your research around a problem that's of significance, then your research should be able to contribute in a positive way to key stakeholders that are working in that space. So contributing new knowledge to those stakeholders, but also in a way that's collaborative and it's an exchange of knowledge. Because in doing the research, you want to engage with key stakeholders so that you can understand the problem more clearly, and then you want to be able to contribute back to those stakeholders through the research that you've done. And contribute to addressing that problem as we move forward. A PhD also is obviously an academic piece of work, so it needs to make a theoretical contribution, so a novel contribution to knowledge. So the work really needs to be clearly embedded in existing knowledge and be building on that work as through the research. So clearly positioned within existing research, but then identifying clearly how you're building on that research to offer something new. So those would be the kind of key, I guess, the three key areas around a research problem that's of significance and importance and interesting, that has the opportunity to offer valuable knowledge exchange and impact in practice, but offers a theoretical contribution. Is there anything that you would like to add to that?
I think just to build on that, I think one of the daunting aspects for students is the idea of a contribution and what merits a contribution. And I think actually thinking about it in terms of what conversation you want to join and where you see that you can add value as a new voice or a new way of thinking, a new way of framing a problem, I think is really important. I know that's something you've spoken about earlier in the podcast series with regard to literature and the importance of embedding your particular particular problem within a literature stream. But I think that really highlights the importance of reading far and wide so that you know what the conversations are saying, and you can start to figure out and delineate where you actually see that there's an opportunity to add in and to add value into that. And I think at this point, that's something that you definitely have, and we can talk about more.
So, Lynn, I think in your PhD that you have definitely contributed to those different knowledge streams. So, would you be able to tell us a bit about those different threads around the theoretical contribution, but also in terms of the research problem and contributions to practice?
Thank you, Deirdre. So, as you know, I've come from industrial practice, policy practice, and that gave me that 360-degree perspective on the circular economy. And so within that, I really wanted to examine the theoretical, from a theoretical perspective, that whole rounded approach by putting the consumer at the centre of the circular economy, something that in the literature at the beginning, I had not seen presented in the literature, and certainly not in other areas such as policy and industrial practice. Very much the consumer has still been positioned in the linear economy at the end as problematized in terms of the disposal options of clothing. Whereas what I wanted to do from a theoretical perspective, supported by yourselves, was really unpack consumer behaviour and really understand where the consumer was contributing to circularity, and that was not acknowledged or needed more exploration in order to, as you were saying, Deirdre, in order to be able to make that contribution, to go back to policy and to say these are some undiscovered, building on research or undiscovered areas of consumer behaviour research that perhaps policy could benefit from looking at. And the same with industry, particularly, and we talked to the textile recycling industry earlier on in the podcast series, and because what I found in the research was that real misalignment a lot of the time between what the consumer thinks they should be doing in terms of clothing disposal and circulation and what the industry actually needs consumers to do. And so that sort of real finding of misalignment can then be a real contributing information to advancing policy and industry advice and support to consumers. But the theoretical lens was really interesting because coming from from a Scottish perspective, Scottish government perspective, from strategy, looking at circular economy literature in policy and industry, contamination is always a key word that comes up. In the resource management sector, contamination of a recycling system or the circulation of goods is always a key challenge. And we discussed contamination and consumer dirt in podcast 3. But what I wanted to really understand using a theoretical lens of contamination and dirt was the consumer experience, because how it's presented from an industrial perspective as just for example, I think an easy way to look at it is when we have foodstuff in plastic packaging. If that goes into the system, it becomes a contamination in the system. But what's the equivalent in consumer clothing? So we have clothing, for example, that looks could look dirty, could look stained, but it's actually been clean and laundered. And so when that goes into the system, the circular system of clothing disposal, how is that then addressed? Is it seen as a contaminant, or is it still seen as a valuable material resource? And this is what I really wanted to investigate with that theory, and to make that layered contribution of nuance of really understanding the nuance of consumer behaviour in that space of decision making, of the everyday lived experience of our clothing experience in the home, in the family setting, which again we have discussed in podcast 4, for example, looking at our methodology, because it's a huge privilege to go into the household, into the family home, and to really learn and observe how contamination and dirt is perceived, but also it's a very sensitive lens. And I think one of the key things I learned in terms of contribution is the sensitivity of addressing and engaging with contamination and dirt, because as individuals, we all experience it in a very different way. And of course, so one of the key sort of affirmations of the research, I suppose, or confirming the conversation that's already out there, is that, of course, the participant sample that we used was of that educated middle class consumer group. And so whilst it confirmed what we know, that consumer group is more willing to engage in recycling and reuse of a potentially perceived contaminated garment, it was much more difficult to perhaps engage with wider areas, socioeconomic areas of society, where the idea of discussing engaging in a conversation about what's clean and dirty is still very much a challenge. And so this theoretical lens and the approach to it, I think the value has been in taking a consumer group that is well researched in the environmental sustainability space, but through this new lens of contamination and dirt, we really learn more about consumer behaviour.
You mentioned, Lynn, there are some of the learnings along the way, and I wonder now in this kind of our final session today, reflecting back on how you achieved what you set out to do, and if you could tell us a little bit about some of the unexpected challenges, but also the opportunities, or as you say, the privilege of being able to carry out this kind of research.
Thanks so much for that question, Kat, and for picking up on that. I mean, I think I was beginning to touch on it a little bit there about how challenging it was, and I know we talked a little bit about this in the methodology podcast, how difficult recruitment was. I had to do quite an extensive recruitment process. I did approach schools and community groups and try to engage in a wide sample. But again, the sensitivity, what I learned was absolutely consumers do want to talk about environmental sustainability. They do really want to learn about keeping our clothes in use for as long as possible. They want to share information, but they want to do that in their own way. And so the challenge was finding consumers who didn't mind talking about the wider experience, that wider lived experience. And so, so I think a key challenge was in that sort of early recruitment. Another challenge, of course, was the pandemic. And my research topic brought up huge challenges, but also fantastic opportunities. One of the key challenges was having a theoretical lens of contamination when the world was experiencing a global pandemic. But I was already so far down the line with the research project that I had to really put that to one side and still keep focused on the research topic of clothing disposal. But what I did find from that was how consumers were adapting in the pandemic. And that was fascinating, how between the time that the research had to be suspended whilst we achieved new ethical approval from the university to carry on with the research, whilst that was occurring, for example, the challenge for consumers was that all of the recycling depots, all of the charity shops, everything had closed down. And of course, this then opened up a huge opportunity actually for consumers to problem solve. And what we saw from that were communities springing up that weren't there before, new Facebook groups, streets with WhatsApp groups, clearing out their garages, clearing out their homes, having product audits, and then putting it on Facebook, WhatsApp, and sharing. So circulating clothing in the local area, circulating children's toys in the local area, things that potentially prior to that phase, people would just automatically dispose them, donate them to the charity shop. And from there, what we learned in the research is that that's not always clear where it's going. We can't always know. And whilst we know that donating to charity is absolutely a fantastic altruistic opportunity, it does bring up questions in terms of the circular economy and circularity. Do we actually know where something is going? And so that idea of, in terms of the theoretical lens, of the scale, from that micro, meso, macro scale that we've discussed earlier on, thinking about the micro as being the home, the individual, and the meso as being community, what we saw was a much greater circulation of products at that community meso level. And so that was really exciting in terms of challenges becoming opportunities. Fantastic story that I really loved was the participant. It was actually Laura, in fact, in podcast 5, who had taken her little girl's leggings, and they had really holy knees, and so she cut them off at the knees and made them into cycling shorts. But then the bottom part of those leggings became face coverings, and so many consumers in the participant sample were making their own face coverings. And I think that was really reflective of potentially what was going on all over the UK. So I think, whilst it was a challenge to go from researching in communities and actually having the privilege of going into the home to then suddenly having to research online, also consumers were left to their own devices, and we learned a lot from that.
So it's really interesting, Lynn, what you've learned about consumers in terms of that richness of information in their everyday practices. But you didn't just research consumers. And I think one of the really interesting things about your research is how what we can learn from those consumers can then inform the, I guess, outside of the micro to the more infrastructural framework that their clothing moves into.
Yes, thanks for bringing that up, Deirdre. I mean, it was amazing having the opportunity to talk to so many industry stakeholders. So just for example, talking to the head of place for the local authority that the research was conducted within. And they had a point about whilst they are support the waste management infrastructure for the local authority, they weren't able to trace. The study was done in Edinburgh. They pointed out that Edinburgh is a very transient city, and so because of the nature of tourism and students, that meant that a lot of product was disposed of that they couldn't keep track of. And particularly with clothing, they weren't actually aware of the amount of volume, for example, that's disposed of in consumer household bins and in the public spaces. And what they were suggesting, though, was that to really open up this issue of clothing disposal to wider areas of the local authority, and to really engage with social services and other ways of reaching out to areas of communities that may benefit from this idea of new models of clothing circularity. From the textile recycling industry perspective, talking to the industry, again, really interesting in terms of understanding that it's still very much a manual process. So at the sorting stage, when we dispose of clothing to the recycling bin, that in our local community, that is still manually sorted. And whilst we have new technologies evolving, we're still quite a way off of that. And so when a consumer donates a piece of clothing to the recycling bin, if it then has to be sorted by another person. And so every stage of the process is subjective, from that first, the owner of the garment deciding to put it in the bin, in the recycling bin, to that idea of someone else subjectively deciding whether this garment is clean, dirty, able to be reused, resold, or actually needs to be recycled, or nothing can happen to it. So really interesting. But then again, we also have a fantastic organisation in Scotland called Revolve. And Revolve is an accreditation scheme for the charity retail sector and other social enterprises reselling consumer clothing. And that's very much about quality control and supporting consumers to, by seeing the accreditation logo, that they can trust that these second-hand garments have been are of a good quality to be sold. And so these were some of the stakeholders that I engaged with. I think what was really interesting was the huge debate around landfill incineration. And in Edinburgh, the City Council policy is a 25-year incineration plant where our household waste goes to. And that's really interesting because whilst it does fuel 54 homes in Midlothian, it is also a key policy challenge and something that we don't want to encourage anymore, incineration. And what was really interesting about that is it really flagged up this issue of the consumers and the participants who were doing the best they could and had particular garments that they just felt were so saturated in maybe a pathogenic or a bacterial contaminant, such as perhaps if a child was really unwell and there was a bit of a mess, and they felt like the most important thing was to get rid of the threat to the family home, and so they would put that in the bin. And so thinking about that, you're thinking, well, maybe that is the most beneficial option for everyone, and then that contaminated garment is then disposed of and incinerated. And so it really brought up the debate about when is it okay to dispose of something in the bin, and this real challenge of consumers always being suspected of just putting anything in the bin. And whilst, yes, there was evidence of that in the literature and also from the participants, in some cases, very few, but we also did have evidence. But what I did find was consumers trying to do the best that they can, and the industry showing evidence of where they are also trying to provide a service, but could really benefit from understanding more about consumer behaviour and the consumer challenges. Just for example, one participant talking about they didn't realise that when you put your clothing in the recycling bin, you need to put it in a bag. And they were thinking, well, I shouldn't put it in a plastic bag because that's really bad for the environment. So they were putting it in individually into the recycling bin. And of course, the textile recycling representatives told me that you can't do that. You have to have it in the bag. If they are fishing out individual garments, to them, that means that they are contaminated, because on occasions people throw pizza boxes, throw other rubbish into those bins. And so if you have garments floating around, they actually then become contaminated with the other possible alien objects in that bin. So real challenges and really new perspectives on what's going on between industry and consumer.
And I think that's one of the really valuable and fascinating parts of your research, isn't it? That you got to speak to each of those stakeholders who are, in a sense, almost operating in the dark from each other, yet what they do is so interconnected and vital.
Absolutely. And I think for so long, I mean, it's only over the last 100 years that the recycling industry has evolved from the rag and bone man. And what I did find was that the sector is really open to new ideas. They do want to engage. They do need to get the best value for what they receive. And so they are looking to understand the consumer in a deeper way, but they are restricted by commerce also and the traditional system that they have. So, but really what I did find is that the door is open. The door is open with industry to work together and to listen to consumers and to listen to researchers and to I think what this also does is it feeds into the new technologies that are being developed, whether that's robotics that are going to be sorting garments in recycling in the future, or whether it's about QR codes, technologies that can really help to understand this challenge of something that might look soiled, but it's actually clean. And so whilst if it looks soiled and it's rejected, it might actually, with new technologies, be accepted. I think also the idea of consumer information and the fact that informing industry that consumers need more information and that will benefit the industry, I think was really important and a really valuable learning point for everyone. I think one of the key informants from industry explained that when you donate a garment to a charity shop, there's a 50-50 chance that garment will be resold in your local area. And the rest of the time it's going to go to potentially overseas markets. And again, this comes back to that idea of traceability in the supply chain and the fact that, and thinking about consumers operating during lockdown when things were circulated in a more local way, we want to see new models across the non-profit circulation of garment sector and the textile recycling industry, models that keep that clothing in use locally or at least traceable. What was fantastic was the amount of entrepreneurship going on with consumers in terms of resale platforms like eBay and Depop, which of course in the contribution we could see that having that traceability to the next stage was so important. If you sell online, you have to send it to someone's address. You know where that garment went next. Whereas in charity retail, as the textile recycling sector said, it's a 50-50. And so, but also, when I did some sort of on-site observations, I did go, for example, with a participant to a refugee donation point. I also went with another participant to H&M, to their textile recycling point. And what was really interesting there was that the garments were being sorted. First of all, they were being disposed of in really clean, dry, inside environments. With the refugee depot, again, everything was being sorted manually, but in a really clean environment, and in being evaluated in so many different ways, in thinking about culture and gender and where things were going to go. So we began to see so many different facets of how the textile recycling sector, or the textile clothing circulation sector, can we say, could really start to look at new models to improve how we secure that traceability of clothing circularity.
I mean, there's some really interesting key touch points that you mentioned there in terms of what we would need to know as donating consumers, thinking about the needs of a refugee donation, for example. But also you said that something can be stained but clean. And maybe just understanding that from both a consumer and a recycler point of view. Could you explain what you mean by stained and clean?
Yeah, thanks so much, Deirdre. Yes, and I think actually, now that I think about it, we talked about this, and what I actually meant was stained and laundered.
Right, okay.
And thanks for reminding me of that. That's a really good point. Yes, I did mean stained but laundered. And I think this is really interesting from a literature perspective, because there was a distinct lack of discussing olfactory with consumers in relation to the condition of a garment. But yet, when I went into someone's home, if they were presenting garments, I could smell, say, the soap powder or the conditioner used within the washing. But perhaps they had sweat stains, like I'd say a white T-shirt with perspiration stains under the arms, but what you were presented with was a really lovely clean T-shirt. But societal acceptability of that perspiration stain, it signals that you don't know whether that garment is clean or has been laundered or not. And so when it goes into the textile recycling system, they're looking at a T-shirt with perspiration stains, not knowing whether it's clean, it's been laundered or not laundered, but seeing it's a cotton T-shirt and it could be fibre reprocessed, the fibre reprocessed, but perhaps the garment not resold. That's really interesting. From one of the key findings and recommendations was about consumer resilience. And I talked a bit about this earlier on, about garments being made into other products. And this was a real finding of the research, was just how involved in textile longevity consumers are, in how they are adapting garments to ensure that either part of that garment is extended, such as children's long school trousers that become school shorts, and through very basic skills. And I was really surprised to learn how active consumers were. Every household out of the 30 participant households I had practiced some form of textile or clothing reuse and longevity. Everything from clothing repair to upcycling to downcycling through the use of a T-shirt becoming, say, a cleaning cloth for a bicycle or work surfaces.
I mean, were these people upskilling themselves, or were these skills that they were brought up with? I mean, it's maybe not something that you'd expect everyone to be able to do, is to make a face mask out of a pair of leggings.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah. I mean, in the case of the face mask out of the pair of leggings, the participant admitted that, that's not something they had the skill to do. And what was really exciting for them about the jersey material was they didn't need to sew a hem or anything. It just folded up. And with the with the face coverings, again, it was a special pattern where you just cut out loops out of the side and you cut the seam up the middle and then you just looped it onto the ear. So there was absolutely no sewing skill involved. Whereas, as we talked about earlier on, a lot of the participants being educated middle class and of a certain age range where they had the benefit of skills. They had the benefit of repair skills or having grown up in environments where they'd either learned basic sewing skills or they had grown up in family environments where you learned craft skills with clothing, or you were just really interested in learning more self-teaching with actually more peer learning, I would have said. Participants really talked about peer learning, peer sharing, and things like a participant who talked about taking her old children's leggings and cutting them into cotton makeup remover pads, and how she'd learned that tip from a neighbour. And so that idea of this peer-to-peer sharing of hints and tips, I mean, that's really creative. But neither of, or that particular participant was a school teacher, not necessarily somebody involved in design per se, who would think about that adaptability. And so, yeah, the sheer breadth of creativity that I experienced from consumers was just incredible.
I think that really speaks to this idea of your research, that you have such a rich data set, which has come from actually spending time with participants. And I wondered, kind of on reflection, how you felt about that opportunity, that you really get to know your participants, you get to understand the sense making and some of their complexities around their behaviours beyond a kind of a questionnaire, which would have been a different approach. If you could say a little bit about the practicalities of that kind of research.
Yeah, I think that the practicalities of it in terms of, well, you're going into the home and you're talking to one representative, but that representative has a whole view of what's going on in the home, and they're probably in charge of that, the management of that clothing circulation and disposal in the home. And I think the kind of really deep information was the sort of relational element, relationships. So, for example, thinking about participants telling me about, say, husband and wife or two partners, and the husband who has his favourite T-shirt, and that favourite T-shirt is completely stained down the front, all sorts of different stains on it, but it's their favourite T-shirt, and they are that's the T-shirt they sleep in. And the partner saying, actually, I would really love to get rid of that. I really, I find it disgusting. But something about that relational element of trust and intimacy, that, again, going back to that stained but laundered, that idea that trust and intimacy within the home has a lot to contribute to whether a garment is used and circulated or disposed of. And while you get that partnership discourse in terms of whether it can be kept in circulation or not, it was really, that's the nuances, that's the understanding that you get from qualitative research, that you get from probing and consumers being so generous in sharing. The idea talking about the whole life cycle, the liminal life cycle, from the experience of a baby in the home, the first few months of that baby, as one participant described it, having a baby grow with a punami in it, and the challenges of managing an item of clothing that is that saturated in pathogenic residue, and what they do with that next. And the fact that you have some homes evaluating that, yeah, they could put it in the washing machine at a certain level of saturation, whereas another home saying, honestly, at that point, it was in the bin. And so that idea of then following that through with children's clothing, with the older children, the age of like 4 to 10, school age, where it's then about the sharing. And again, learning that intimacy of the circulation of school clothing being passed down through siblings. And what was really interesting there, going back to the staining and laundered issue, was really interesting. And of course, through the contamination dirt theory lens, what I found was with school clothing that had chemical stains on it, say children's paints and pen from school, parents were really happy to pass that on throughout the neighbourhood, next door neighbour, everybody's kids going to the same school. They were okay with that. But what wasn't so okay was food stains. So even though both garments would be passed on laundered, what was really interesting was that nuance of a chemical stain was okay to be passed on, but a food stain not okay. And as we discussed in the theory chapter, there's a lot to be unpacked there in terms of what we know from the literature about how that relates to the natural consumer response to protect the family from ingested substances that are then excreted, and how that becomes a real threat to the whole family unit. So the idea that a food stain signals a threat. So going back to that, and I know I'm getting really technical here, but going back to that idea of something stained but laundered is critical to how we're thinking about the future of the circularity, not just of clothing, but of product in general. What was really interesting were consumers who did have, say, waterproof garments that were like an overjacket that for all weathers, that they had perhaps had, several participants had jackets like that they'd had for a long time, that were repairable and had been repaired and repaired and repaired, had been, say, a waterproof coat that had been re-waterproofed. But then it gets to a tipping point where they have tried everything, and there is just that garment becomes not able to perform its function. If its function is to keep you dry and you have done your absolute best, what I did find with participants was their exasperation, that then they felt, I really don't know what to do with this. I can deconstruct. And some of them could deconstruct the garment. They could perhaps use some of the material for patches, but then they began to think, how many patches can I actually go through? How much do I actually need? Many households had what they called the rag bag. And I certainly grew up with a rag bag. I think rag bag is something very traditional to the home, and it might have lots of different bits of fabric in it from old garments. It might have whole garments in there that people are thinking, oh, I'll maybe make a craft project out of that. Or maybe the old odd socks and the old sock puppet trick. But there comes a point when even the most dynamic, creative, resilient consumers are like, I really have to move on this stuff. And it's part of that family life cycle. And so it's about then how are they supported to push it on in the right way, and to be informed that even that garment, that waterproof jacket that just could not be worn, and in the consumer participant's point of view, it needed to be binned. Was that actually the right solution? And could it have been done in a different way?
I was just going to say, I think one of the real kind of points of value from your thesis is that you do speak to this nexus of policy, practice and academia. in terms of that support that is necessary for consumers. And I wondered, what are the next steps? I know it's a big question, but how do you take that new knowledge forward in terms of tackling this huge issue?
Well, I mean, I'm really passionate about that peer-to-peer learning, that idea that consumers share knowledge. And as I said earlier about the participant who had created the makeup pads, and she got that tip from her neighbour or her friend. And so it's how do we now, we have the opportunity to create, Professor Shaw and I and yourself, we have new funding to develop a consumer exhibition which takes the knowledge from the research and disseminates it with the with an advisory panel, a consumer advisory panel, feeding in and making sure that we're getting that knowledge right. And we have the opportunity to work with the Scottish Libraries Information Council and make sure that we are reaching a national audience through a library network. And I think that's really exciting in terms of the national debate about the future of the community library and how it reinvents itself and how it becomes a support hub for reuse and repurposing. Of course, in terms of academia, it's all about how we take forward the dissemination of the research and contribute to the conversation. And that's something that we're doing at the moment, and we'll be sharing with our colleagues soon. And in terms of policy, I think it's about how we make those reports accessible to policy. In Scotland, we have the cross-party working group on the circular economy, and we are in discussion with some of the members there about how we develop our research to be able to present it to them and share our findings and our advice, particularly in relation to consumer advice and guidance and what's occurring in industry and how we need to look at the future of investment in both consumer information and support and industry, circular industry processes.
And I think one of the really exciting things about this as well is that exchange. So thinking about the consumer exhibition, for example, is bringing in industry into that too. So you have that exchange of knowledge between the consumers and what they do and what they want to know, and industry in terms of what their current practices are, but how that can inform them going forward. So that kind of two-way exchange is really exciting.
It is, Deirdre, and a while ago, the Textile Recycling Association gave us the invitation to go to textile recycling depots and to take consumers there to have a look. And we're certainly going to take them up on that opportunity as part of the exhibition. And again, be able to work with our consumer advisory group to explore the learnings from that trip and what do consumers think are the most important things to share with other consumers in terms of how clothing is being recycled, but also how those consumers can feed into industry about what they've observed and learned and how they can help, how we can all help to improve the quality of clothing circulating.
So Lynn, reflecting on where you are now at the end of the PhD journey, how does that reflect where you were at the beginning? You know, like this was a ESRC funded project. So we had come initially, Kat and I, with the idea about unpacking the consumer and circularity. And then you've really taken this project and brought it to life through a contamination lens. But it'd be really nice to hear about, you know, given where you are now and reflecting back at that earlier stage, is this what you expected?
I think it's been a huge privilege and I thank you both for the opportunity because it has really been, I remember thinking about it starting from day one, that in my mind, contamination was the key problem. I think because I'd been so close to circular economy policy and strategy in the UK and had really understood that industry perspective. But whilst I had been involved in consumer information campaigns, I hadn't been close enough to the consumer. And I really came with that ambition to unpack this idea of contamination. And really early on, I was able to find other scholars in different disciplines beginning to think about a contamination in the circular economy, but again, not from the consumer perspective. And so having that opportunity to really address the area that I think is most important right now, and to do that with consumers, when I look at the PhD that I've achieved, I believe for me, it's really where I want to be in the circular economy discussion. And I did set out saying I want to put the consumer at the centre of the circular economy. And that was critical to me. And as you know, and I come from a design background and I'm very partial to an infographic and demonstrating visually what that circular, putting the consumer in the centre of the circular economy looks like. And I was able to really unpack that through this PhD. And so through creating that diagram and then entering into the dialogue with the literature and then the core field work, and then coming up with the model that achieved what I wanted to do was such an exhilarating and important moment for me. And there's just that sense that when you get to the end of it all and you read it back and you think, yeah, I was right. I was right to pursue this route. And I think I believe, I know I've found new evidence and new information. And I'm just ready now to share that with those three areas, with academia, industry and policy. And and really important to also look at the model that I've created and how we start to test that model in a wider socio-demographic. I'm really committed to how we might do that. But overall, it's been a really hard journey. I think you can't pull the wool over anybody's eyes about how hard a PhD is, how difficult the journey is, but how exhilarating and rewarding it is at the end. And yeah, I feel really privileged to be able to have seen it through in the way I wanted to. I feel that at the end of the day, this is the PhD that I wanted to produce, but richer than I thought, particularly thinking back to chapter 3 and the theoretical lens and learning the history of dirt and contamination all the way from Douglas through to Rosen, Argo and Dahl, right up to Orosicchio and Baxter exploring it now, and entering into that heritage and then being able to build on that and now be able to produce my contribution is absolutely everything. It's really exciting.
And I think it is exciting in the sense that it's not actually the end. You know, as you say, there's still so much to be done in terms of that knowledge sharing among different stakeholders, but also in terms of continuing to build that knowledge with different consumer groups and engaging with other stakeholders going forward.
Yeah, and I think that's definitely key.
And I think it's very much the start of a conversation, that you've got this research so far, but very much open to taking it forward and being able to talk to different stakeholders about it and the opportunities, as you say, of new technology and engaging with community groups to take it forward.
Yeah, absolutely, Kat. And I think on that note, I'd just like to thank you both again for your support and secure your support for the next part of the journey. Thank you for listening and watching Cleaning the Loop, Driving Consumer Clothing Circularity, a podcast series produced by the Adam Smith Business School, University of Glasgow. If you would like to know more about my research or that of the scholars participating in the podcast series, please email me at lynn.wilson@glasgow.ac.uk. Thank you for listening and watching.